They were children with roots in a culture they barely knew, and a search that, as it widened, exposed not only missing footprints, but a trail of family ties investigators had not followed. Hit subscribe and turn on your bell now for first-hand updates. This story keeps changing as new voices are finally brought into the circle. On the surface, this looks like the familiar steps of a missing children inquiry, a last seen time, repeated searches, forensic teams, and volunteers combing rugged land. But underneath those operational details is a more troubling theme, one that echoes across many cold and active cases: relatives who were never asked, cultural connections overlooked, and a domestic history that, according to family members, included controlling behavior that might matter now. Below is a careful, detailed report that stitches together what investigators learned about the children's indigenous family ties, why those ties matter, and how these newly surfaced family accounts could change both the timeline and the investigation's focus. Investigators located Malaya's father using a Halifax parking ticket address. The discovery of the children's maternal grandfather almost reads like a procedural footnote, a parking ticket providing an address, and yet it reveals a broader pattern of missed contact. Police trawled digital records, public databases, and leads, and a routine parking fine led them to a Halifax address where Malaya's father lived. It's the sort of mundane bureaucratic trace that often surfaces in detailed record searches, but it also highlights how easily kin can be absent from an early investigative map. For months, the police priority understandably focused on immediate household members, on ground searches around the property, and on digital traces closer to the time of disappearance. But families are networks, and in this case, a primary node of that network, a man who remembers Lily and Jack fondly, had not been on the investigatory checklist until a mundane municipal bill pointed the way. That omission matters for several reasons. First, grandparents and extended relatives often hold critical context: custody patterns, informal childcare arrangements, medical histories, and details of disputes or escalating behavior that parents may not disclose. Second, grandparents sometimes serve as firmer anchors in fragmented family situations. They may have insight into who the children spent time with, or whether the household was under stress. Third, locating a relative only via a parking ticket suggests that the family was not consistently in contact, an important social detail. The investigative lesson is clear. In missing persons inquiries, small administrative traces can identify relatives who should have been consulted earlier. Overlooking them risks losing context that might point to overlooked leads or offer corroborating testimony. He was never contacted by police about the children's disappearance. Perhaps the starkest allegation from the family side is that Malaya's father, the grandfather, was never contacted when the children went missing. If true, this represents a communicative and procedural gap. From an institutional perspective, police routinely notify immediate next of kin and, where appropriate, extended family members. They also document outreach attempts. When that outreach does not occur, questions naturally follow. Was the family contact list incomplete? Were there legal barriers to contacting certain relatives? Or did the early focus on other leads simply crowd out thorough family outreach? Family members described the hurt of learning the news indirectly, via media or secondhand reports, rather than directly from investigators. That rupture between authorities and kin can erode trust at a critical moment. Families need information, and they need to feel included in the search process, not sidelined by it. From the investigative angle, missing early interviews with relatives creates a practical loss. Memories fade, domestic rhythms change, and early recollections, the ones closest to the disappearance, can be the most precise. By the time an outreach occurs weeks or months later, precise temporal details may have dimmed. Restoring those channels now is essential, not only for the emotional well-being of relatives, but because those conversations can yield timestamps, photos, and anecdotal clues recruiters and searchers need. Grandfather recalls Lily and Jack as happy, living mostly with great-grandmother. When the grandfather finally spoke, his memories painted a different domestic picture than some public accounts suggested. He recalled Lily and Jack as joyful, affectionate children who spent significant time with their great-grandmother. That kind of caregiving arrangement, children spending extended periods with older relatives, is common in many families and carries practical implications for any investigation. Children who split time between households may have routines and relationships that do not show up in a single home's calendar. Favored hiding spots, family visitors, multiple caregivers who could account for presence or absence, and cross-household items that might explain the origin of an object found near a scene. The grandfather's recollection that the children spent more time with their great-grandmother also reframes the social geography of their lives. Investigators who had concentrated searches and interviews around the immediate household needed to expand that focus to include the great-grandmother's residence, the routes between homes, and the social circles that formed the children's extended world. Even memories that appear anecdotal, the detail of a child's laugh, a small fear, a repeated play routine, can orient searchers toward likely movement patterns or to witnesses who, because they live farther from the primary home, were not originally canvassed. He last saw Lily when she visited a year earlier. The gap between the grandfather's last sighting of Lily, about a year before the disappearance, and the time of the missing persons report illustrates how fragmented family contact had become. A year is long in the life of a child. It is a span in which relationships shift, routines change, and new caregivers can assume primary responsibility. That time gap also makes the grandfather's later shock and pain intelligible. He had not been part of the children's everyday circle for months, and when the disappearance occurred, he had fewer recent memories to offer investigators. From an evidentiary standpoint, that gap matters because it limits the grandfather's ability to provide up-to-the-minute corroboration for household conditions, guest lists, or specific events in the days leading up to the disappearance. But his longer-term recollections are still valuable. They show how the relationship network had thinned and suggest possible reasons why the children were, in effect, disconnected from a wider family support structure. Disconnection increases vulnerability in multiple ways. Through fewer external adults watching for signs of trouble, less cultural continuity, and fewer people who could corroborate movements or offer sheltering explanations for where children might have gone. Children rarely visited their indigenous family or learned Mi'kmaq culture. Perhaps the most poignant theme in the family testimony is cultural estrangement. According to relatives, Lily and Jack rarely visited their indigenous family and had limited exposure to Mi'kmaq traditions and language. That lost connection is meaningful not only in human terms, children deprived of cultural belonging, but also in practical investigative terms. Children who participate in cultural and extended family networks tend to be more visible to larger groups of adults. There are more people who know their patterns, more potential witnesses to their movements, and more institutional supports that can mobilize when something goes wrong. Lack of regular contact with Indigenous can also complicate how the disappearance is experienced and responded to within the community. Indigenous communities often mobilize differently, including informal networks, elders, and community-specific search practices, yet those mobilizations presuppose ongoing connection. When such connection is weak, a missing child event may not trigger those community-based responses as quickly or as coherently. That gap is not simply a social sorrow. It can have concrete consequences for how information flows in the crucial early hours and days after a disappearance. Grandmother displayed family photos including Lily, Jack, and Malaya. At the grandmother's home, family photos lined tables and walls, laughter frozen in time, birthday smiles, and earlier visits that felt intimately familiar to relatives but had been absent from the public narrative. Those photographs accomplish several things. They humanize the children in a way that raw case files cannot. They also reveal relationships and patterns of visitation that investigators might not have seen. Photos often contain metadata, dates on the back, the context of an event, or the names of surrounding adults that can provide documentary anchors for timelines. Family album pictures can corroborate claims about where a child was on a certain occasion, who was present, and what relatives knew about custody patterns. The display of images also reflected the family's grief and confusion, relatives who had loved the children and felt sidelined by early investigatory channels. The grandmother's urge to show those photos was less an exhibition than an attempt to be seen as part of the children's circle, to say, in effect, "We were here, and we should have been asked sooner." Malaya updated her Indigenous status card during a visit to family. One detail that drew investigators' attention was Malaya's decision to update her Indigenous status card during a family visit. That administrative act is not merely bureaucratic. It can signify reconnection with cultural identity, renewed claim to community resources, and a legal recognition that opens pathways for assistance and advocacy. Updating a status card may indicate a momentary re-engagement with kin networks and may also mark a potential window in which family members had more direct contact with Malaya. Investigators saw that visit as a potential point where contemporaneous statements were shared, issues were discussed, or help could have been sought. But the card update also highlighted the complexity of identity documentation. Not all Indigenous people are registered in the same way. Some have ancestral ties without formal recognition, and the consequences of legal status, eligibility for certain services, community membership, or cultural supports vary. For investigators and family members alike, the update was both a human sign and a procedural clue. Someone was, temporarily, re-establishing contact with the family's cultural center. Grandmother reported Malaya said Daniel Martel restrained her and took her phone. Among the most troubling family claims is the grandmother's report that Malaya once said Daniel had restrained her and taken her phone. This allegation is serious and potentially very relevant. If a partner physically restrained the mother or controlled her communications, investigators would treat that information as a lead about domestic control and coercion, patterns that can relate directly to child safety and to opportunities for concealment or obstruction. The allegation, as reported by the grandmother, requires careful corroboration. Investigators seek to verify whether such incidents were documented, whether third parties observe signs of coercive control, and whether there are digital records, missing messages, sudden deletions, or changes in device behavior, consistent with a phone being seized. Caution is necessary in public reporting because allegations are not proof. But from an investigative angle, controlling behavior inside a household changes the calculus. It narrows who had access to devices, who could restrict other adults' communication, and who might have the motive or ability to shape the early narrative about the children's absence. It also raises the stakes for interviewing the mother, the partner, and close relatives to create a chronology of complaints and incidents that may point to escalations or to missed opportunities for intervention by child welfare authorities. Children have Mi'kmaq heritage, but lack official tribal status. Another complicating factor is that the children have Mi'kmaq ancestry, but reportedly lack formal tribal registration. Official status matters in practical ways. Registered status can open service pathways, provide community supports, and, importantly in a missing persons context, make it more likely that Indigenous organizations are formally notified and mobilized quickly. Lack of registration doesn't erase heritage, of course, but it can mean the difference between an early community-led search and a slower mobilization that depends on official notification channels. This status gap also points to historical and systemic issues. Registration processes are bureaucratic, sometimes intrusive, and have variable uptake. Families separated by distance, by legal fights, or by distrust of institutions may not keep registries up to date. From a social justice perspective, the fact that these children's cultural identity was not mirrored by bureaucratic recognition is a reminder of how colonial structures continue to shape vulnerability in practical ways. Family and community see the case linked to missing Indigenous women and children.